The wind had a language of its own in those hills. It moaned through the slats of the old barn like it mourned her, like it knew the weight of her silence. The structure itself was more bones than shelter, weather-worn, spine-bent, and half-swallowed by weeds. But it was the only place they left her. And that, too, was intentional. She was 22. Slender and dust-covered, with a body that looked delicate only to those who hadn't seen her carry heavy water pails down frost-bitten slopes. Her hands bore the marks of every season she'd endured beneath their roof, scratches that never seemed to fully close, purpled bruises that faded just in time to make room for new ones. She had no name to most folks anymore. The town knew her as the daughter-in-law, a term heavy with pity and distance, and to the ones who'd brought her here, her dead husband's parents, she was simply her. Like a task to be tolerated. They hadn't always been so cruel. At first, they were indifferent. Her husband's sudden death, a timber accident that took more blood than breath, had shocked them into grief too bitter to share. And when, a year later, her belly remained empty and her eyes a little too sad for their liking, they turned cold. One morning, the mother-in-law set down a tin plate with nothing but a heel of bread and said, "A wife who can't give or do has no business in a house." And that was that. The barn door became her wall. Her ceiling. Her prison. The first few nights were worse than anything she could have braced for. The mice scattered along the hay with the audacity of owners, and the cold came in through the floor, biting up through her bones. She curled into herself like a question mark, wishing she were someone simpler, someone useful. Her voice had grown thin from disuse, worn down like a tool that no longer fit its purpose. In the daylight, they made her work, mending fence posts with cracked hands, scrubbing floors she would never be allowed to walk barefoot on. And then each dusk, they shoved her back into the barn with a muttered warning or a sneer. Sometimes a blow. Sometimes just silence. They didn't hit her often. They didn't need to. The barn was punishment enough. Yet even in that dark, she kept a thread of herself alive. She whispered lullabies to the wind. Songs her mother had sung in a kitchen full of warmth and cinnamon, songs about rivers and stars and girls who were not afraid of the dark. She sang softly, cautiously, like someone tending a tiny fire inside her chest. Something that hadn't gone out just yet. There was a horse in the barn, an old one, sway-backed and half-blind. She would press her face into its neck when the fear felt loudest, and it would nudge her gently as if to say, "You're not nothing." That was the closest thing to love she'd felt in many months. One morning, the ground outside was frost-white, the grass brittle as glass. Her breath came out in little ghosts. She sat near the barn wall where a split in the wood let a shard of light crawl in. She held her hands in it like it was fire. She wanted it to mean something. She wanted warmth to mean she still belonged to the living. From somewhere far, a crow called out. Then another. Then silence. The mother-in-law's voice rang across the yard, sharp as iron. Something about not being seen in town. About how shame stuck to women like flies to sugar. The man, her father-in-law, grunted, loud and satisfied. That was the rhythm of them. They fed each other cruelty like spoonfuls of soup. She looked down at her feet, bare again. The skin was cracked. A toe had started to bleed without her noticing. The pain was dull now, like everything else. That evening, the wind picked up. It screamed against the barn walls, dragged its nails across the roof. She pulled the old horse blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to sleep. But the wind had brought something new with it. Something she didn't recognize at first. A sound. Faint. She sat up, her ears straining past the groaning wood, past the rattling latch. It was hoofbeats. Not the slow plod of their mule. This was different. Lighter. Steadier. She held her breath. The sound faded. Later, when the moon had climbed high and the cold became something living and cruel, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She cried. At first, it was quiet. Just the leak of a heart too full to hold back anymore. But then it came heavier, mouth covered with her hand, shoulders shaking. There was no one to hear her. No one ever did. The barn didn't echo. It swallowed. Except, the next morning, before the sun had cut through the trees, she found something near the barn door. A piece of cloth. Wrapped around a heel of fresh bread. She blinked. Looked around. No footprints in the dirt. No note. She clutched the bread to her chest and ate it slowly, eyes on the gap in the wall. The same shaft of light returned, touching her like a promise. The day passed quietly. The in-laws didn't mention the food. Perhaps they hadn't noticed she was a bit stronger. Perhaps they didn't care. The following dawn, she heard hoofbeats again. This time, she went to the barn wall and pressed her eye against the gap. He was sitting on a horse near the tree line. A wide-brimmed hat covered his face. He didn't move. Didn't approach. He just watched the house with a stillness that wasn't threatening, just patient. And then he turned and rode away. The next morning, another cloth bundle. She didn't touch it right away. She waited. Watched the tree line again. He didn't come that day. But the bread was warm. She took the bundle in her lap and whispered, not knowing if the wind would carry it. "Thank you." That night, the barn didn't feel like it was swallowing her whole. The walls still creaked. The hay still poked through the blanket. But something small and stubborn bloomed in her chest. Someone had heard her cry. And they had answered. The story wasn't over. Not yet. The man rode alone, always had. That kind of quiet didn't come from habit, it came from loss, carved into him by the years like wind against rock. Folks in town didn't talk much about him anymore. Not out of fear or disrespect, just a shared understanding. Some people choose the edges of things. He was one of them. He wasn't old, 30, maybe 31, but life had weathered him quicker than most. His face was clean-shaven but shadowed by a brimmed hat nearly always pulled low, his eyes a kind of gray that didn't change with the sky. He didn't smile easily. He didn't frown either. Most days he looked like a man still listening for something that never spoke back. His cabin sat a good ride beyond the nearest fence line, tucked between two hills and a stream that whispered at night. He lived with his horse, a lean sorrel with a stubborn gait, and the silence. Both had proven faithful in a world that didn't promise much. He worked with leather mostly, saddles, reins, boots when someone asked nicely. The rest of the time he fixed what needed fixing, chopped what needed chopping, and tried not to look too long at the empty space beside the fire where a second chair once sat. The letters from his mother were still folded in a drawer, even though she'd passed 5 winters ago. He didn't open them anymore, but he didn't throw them out either. That was how he treated most things, didn't reach for more than what came to him, didn't let go of what had meant something once. The day he heard her cries, he hadn't meant to ride that way. He'd been out checking fence posts where the wire sagged after the last storm. The wind was sharp, full of dry cold that bit through the collar of his coat. He was headed toward the northern ridge when he heard it, faint, fractured. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something human. He pulled the reins, tilted his head. Nothing now. Just the breeze rustling the weeds. But then again, there. Soft and strangled. Not words, just sound. Pain made small by distance. He didn't hurry. He rarely did. But he turned the horse and rode slow toward it. The barn came into view, slouched and half-eaten by time. He knew the property, belonged to the elder couple who'd buried their only boy 3 winters back. Heard talk in town they'd grown strange, mean with grief. He didn't traffic in gossip, but he remembered the wife's face, sharp and dry like old parchment, eyes like stones turned over too many times. He didn't ride close. Just far enough to see. No one in the yard. Smoke from the chimney. He paused beneath the trees, still as a scarecrow. And then he heard it again, closer now, behind the barn wall. He said nothing. Made no move. He left. The next morning, before the sun reached the tops of the pines, he wrapped a heel of bread in cloth and laid it on a flat rock near the barn. He didn't knock. Didn't call. Just watched the house to make sure no one saw. Then he rode back the way he came. The following morning, he did it again. She never appeared. But the cloth was always gone by afternoon. He didn't know what her face looked like. Just the blur of a shadow through wood slats. But he could feel something different in the air now when he rode that way, like the land itself had paused to breathe. On the 5th morning, he saw her. She'd come out from behind the barn just as he was turning to go. Thin frame wrapped in a frayed shawl, dark hair half-braided, the rest blown across her face. She didn't speak. Didn't wave. Just stared. He didn't move. Then she stepped back, slow, disappeared behind the wall like a ghost uncertain if it wanted to be seen. He left bread again. That night he didn't sleep well. He kept thinking about the way she'd looked at him, not afraid, not hopeful. Just, waiting. The next morning, he brought 2 pieces. Still, she didn't come out. But the day after, there she was again. Standing in the space between barn and fence, arms crossed tight against the cold. Watching. He raised a hand. Not a wave, just a greeting. A recognition. She didn't return it, but she didn't turn away. He rode closer this time, just a few paces. Enough to see her face better. She was young. Younger than he'd expected. But her eyes weren't. They had the look of someone who'd already buried parts of herself and wasn't sure which ones could be dug back up. He didn't speak. Neither did she. After a long moment, she nodded. Barely. But it was something. The next morning, she was waiting. He dismounted slowly, unwrapped the bread, and placed it on the same flat rock. She stepped forward. Not shy, not bold. Just measured, like someone testing the weight of her own legs. They stood there in silence. He studied the bruises on her wrist, the way her hands trembled slightly when she took the bread. Cold out here, he said finally, his voice low, like boots on pine needles. She didn't answer. He didn't expect her to. I'll leave a blanket next time, he added. She looked up. Just a flicker. Then down again. He rode off. That night, it snowed lightly. The kind that didn't stick, just whispered against the windows. He thought of her again, curled on cold hay, trying to sleep with that wind howling through the boards. He thought of the old barn, how even the strongest beams crack in silence. He rose before dawn, folded a thick wool blanket, and rode through the mist. She wasn't outside when he arrived. He placed the blanket on the same rock, tucked beneath a piece of wood to keep it from blowing off. Then he waited. 10 minutes. Maybe 20. Then he heard the barn door creak. She stepped out, wearing the same thin shawl. Her eyes scanned the trees before settling on him. He watched as she approached, slow and steady. When she reached the blanket, she stopped. Didn't pick it up. Just stared at it. Then at him. I didn't steal nothing, she said quietly, voice rough from disuse. I know, he said. They said I was useless. Dead weight. Said I should be grateful they even let me stay. He didn't answer. Just listened. I didn't ask to stay. The wind moved between them, tugging at the edge of her shawl. He dismounted, careful, and stood beside his horse. You don't have to explain, he said. Her eyes filled for the first time, not with tears, but disbelief. Like someone had finally said something that didn't bruise. I don't know where else to go, she whispered. You don't have to yet. She looked down at the blanket again. Then back at him. Thank you, she said, and it nearly broke him, the way she said it like a question, like she wasn't sure kindness was real anymore. He nodded once. Then turned, mounted, and rode away. He didn't look back. But the next morning, he brought 2 more blankets, and a tin of stew wrapped in a rag to keep it warm. She took it wordlessly, and for the first time, she smiled. Not a wide smile. Just the edge of one. But it stayed with him long after he disappeared into the trees. Snow came again, this time with purpose. It blanketed the earth in quiet and softened even the cruelest shapes. The barn's roof sagged heavier now, and the cold crept deeper through its bones, but she no longer slept entirely alone. The blanket he'd left her was thick, worn in ways that told of use and care. She wrapped herself in it with reverence, the way one might hold a child, a memory, a second chance. And each morning, she found something new, a biscuit still warm in its cloth, a small jar of honey, even once, a pair of gloves, stitched at the edges with thread that didn't quite match. She could tell he'd made them. Not for her, perhaps, but they fit her hands as if they had waited all this time for her fingers to fill them. She hadn't spoken since that morning by the rock. Not in full, not about herself. She still felt the ache of old warnings, don't speak unless asked, don't want what's not offered. But the silence between them was different now. It wasn't the kind that punished, it invited. On the 4th evening after the snow began to fall, she stepped outside the barn and found him waiting by the tree line. He didn't dismount. Just nodded, then tilted his head toward the trail. No words. No pressure. Just an open door. She followed. His cabin was smaller than she expected, but it breathed. The walls held stories in the way they leaned, and the fire crackled like it missed the sound of footsteps. He opened the door and stepped aside. She hesitated, then entered. The warmth hit her slow, unfurling in her lungs, her shoulders, her spine. It smelled like cedar, like earth, like something old and good. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer comfort too quickly. Just stirred the pot over the fire, ladled out stew into a tin bowl, and placed it on the table. She ate in silence, hands shaking, but her eyes met his once, just long enough to say thank you in a language made of glances. Afterward, he laid out a bedroll near the hearth, more blankets folded neatly on top. Then he stepped outside to tend to the horse. That first night, she didn't sleep much. Not for fear, she didn't fear him, but because her body didn't yet believe it could rest. Still, the fire's glow kept her company. She watched its shadows dance on the walls and let her breathing fall into rhythm with the wind against the windows. By morning, he had coffee brewing, a simple gesture that filled the whole room with warmth again. They didn't talk much. Words came like slow rain, scattered and soft. He told her his name only once. She didn't repeat it aloud. But she kept it. In time, she started helping, small things. Folding the cloths he'd washed. Mending a tear in his coat. Sweeping the dust that gathered near the corners of the floor. He never asked. But he watched. And when she worked, he nodded like it mattered. One day, while boiling water to clean the tin cups, she looked at him and said, "They told me I was barren." He didn't flinch. They said it was a curse. That I'd dried up before I was even a woman. Still, he didn't speak. She kept her gaze low, but her voice steadied. They said no man would want me now. That I'd bring shame if I stayed. That I should be grateful for the barn. The fire popped, but neither of them moved. "I'm not," she said, her voice thin but clear. "I'm not grateful." At last, he spoke. They were wrong. Just those 3 words. And in them, every truth she hadn't dared let herself believe. She turned toward him then, really looked. He wasn't handsome the way stories describe, but there was something solid in him, like river stone, something that could not be washed away by time or cruelty. He saw her differently than the others had. Not as someone ruined, or delicate, or broken. But as someone enduring. As someone worth seeing. One afternoon, a bird flew into the side of the cabin and fell hard into the snow. She ran out barefoot, scooped it up with bare hands, and brought it inside. He didn't stop her. Didn't say it was useless. They sat by the fire and tended to the fragile thing. She warmed it in a small cloth, whispered to it in soft, broken tones. He watched her, quiet, respectful. By nightfall, the bird fluttered once, twice, and flew from her hands to the beam above the fire. She smiled then. And he did too. It was the first time she saw his smile fully, how it softened his eyes and curved gently, almost reluctantly, at the corners of his mouth. Like he'd forgotten how, but hadn't quite lost the muscle. Later, as dusk crept in again, she stood by the door, looking out toward the woods. "They'll come looking," she said. He didn't ask who. He already knew. "They won't want me back," she added, almost bitterly. "Not to care for. Just to control. For pride. For image. They won't get past me," he said. Not as a threat. Just a fact. She didn't answer. But she stepped away from the door, took a seat by the fire, and folded her hands in her lap. A long silence passed. Then she spoke again. "I used to dream of running. Thought if I could just get far enough, I'd become someone else." "You don't need to become anyone else," he said. She looked at him. "You already made it through." That night, the wind howled, but she didn't wake with fear. The firelight flickered across her cheek, and for the first time in many months, she let her eyes close without dread. It wasn't love yet. It was something deeper. A promise being built from patience. A quiet, unfolding kind of safety. And in that quiet, her heart began to remember how to hope. The thaw came slow that year. Winter clung to the hills like an old sorrow, reluctant to let go. Snow melted into mud, and the wind softened, though it still carried a bite. Inside the cabin, the warmth held steady. Firewood stacked high by the door, coffee always brewing by first light, and her presence, a quiet current that changed the shape of every day. She no longer asked if she was staying. He no longer hinted that she might leave. They moved around each other with unspoken grace, fixing what was broken, sharing meals without ceremony, tending the small, steady things that life required. No grand declarations. No need. A single glance often said what 20 words could not. But peace in this world was never left untouched for long. It happened on a wind-laced afternoon, clouds moving fast above the pines, the kind of sky that made men uneasy. She was outside, hanging linens to dry, her hands pink from the cold. He was working on the fencing near the trail when he heard it, the slow grind of wagon wheels, the uneven rhythm of hooves. He straightened, narrowed his eyes toward the road. Dust curled up behind 2 mules, and then he saw them. The in-laws. Their presence cracked the horizon like thunder. He didn't go inside. He didn't call for her. He just stood, arms loose by his sides, waiting. The wagon pulled up hard, rocking slightly. The older man climbed down first, still thick around the shoulders, though age had dulled his gait. His face held the same stiff contempt as always. The woman followed, her mouth pressed into a line so tight it seemed like she'd forgotten how to speak without venom. She stepped out from the trees behind the cabin, her arms full of cloth. When she saw them, she froze. The older woman pointed. "There she is." No greeting. No remorse. Just claim. "She left without permission. Stole from us. We've come to take her back." The cowboy didn't move. "She's not yours to take." The man laughed, but there was no mirth in it. "She's our daughter-in-law. She belongs to the family. The land. The name. She's not livestock," he said. "She's a liar," the woman spat. "And barren. No good to anyone. You think you're doing a noble thing? You'll regret it." Behind him, she stepped forward. Slowly. Carefully. She didn't hide. "I didn't steal anything," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "And I'm not going back." "You don't get to decide," the man snapped. "Yes," she said. "I do." They turned on her then, all fury and insult, as if her spine, now straight, now steady, was an offense in itself. But this time, she didn't flinch. The cowboy stepped between them, not with fists, not with threats, just with presence. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." The man reached toward his coat, but the cowboy didn't blink. "I won't ask again." The woman pulled her husband back by the sleeve. Her eyes, wild with rage, met the younger woman's. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "No man wants a woman who can't give him children." The cowboy turned to her then, not the woman who spoke, but the one behind him. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Because the look he gave her, steady, warm, sure, undid every cruel word spoken in that moment and all the moments before. And she saw it, clear as the firelight at night. They left without another word. The wagon groaned under their weight, vanishing slowly down the trail. The dust settled, but the wind stayed sharp, like it too had something to say. Inside the cabin, she stood by the hearth, one hand still gripping the edge of the table. "They'll tell the town," she said. "They might," he replied. She looked down at the worn wood beneath her fingers. "I don't care." He poured coffee, handed her a mug. "Good." She took it, sipped, and set it down. Then turned to him. "Do you," she asked, "care what they think?" She nodded. He shook his head, slow. "I care what you need," he said. The fire popped between them. Outside, the wind had calmed. "I'm not afraid of being alone," she whispered. "I know. But I'm tired of it." He stepped closer. Not to rescue her. Not to claim her. Just to meet her where she stood. "You're not alone now." There was no ceremony in their closeness, no sudden kiss or theatrical vow. Just a silence so deep and kind it made room for something larger than words. She leaned against him, not because she was weak, but because she chose to. In the weeks that followed, they worked side by side. She mended his coats with careful stitches. He taught her to plant beans in straight lines. They laughed once, unexpectedly, when the goat got into the oats and refused to come out from under the porch. And in the quiet hours, when the fire burned low and the world outside was just a sleeping beast, they shared pieces of themselves like offerings, a memory here, a question there. Nothing rushed. Nothing forced. One morning, she woke before him, the sun barely risen. She stepped outside and looked out at the hills, now green again, kissed by spring. She could see the old path that led back to the place she'd escaped, the barn still visible in her mind. But it no longer held her. She was not the same woman who had cried into the hay, barefoot and silenced. She had walked out of that place and into this one. And this time, she stayed. He stepped out behind her, mug in hand, eyes squinting against the light. "Cold?" "A little," she said. He set the mug down, took her hand. They stood that way for a long time, watching the sky change color. "You don't have to say it," she murmured. "I wasn't going to," he said with a soft smile. But he squeezed her hand gently, and that was enough. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes quiet as a horse's breath, steady as a man who doesn't flinch when you tell him what others threw away. And sometimes, it saves you not with grand rescue, but by staying. By listening. By saying nothing when nothing needs to be said. The wind picked up again, but it carried no threat. Only warmth. Only spring. Only the sound of two hearts learning how to beat alongside each other again.